The UK's post-Brexit policing pact with the EU is based on the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA, which was agreed in 2020. The TCA includes provisions on sharing of DNA, fingerprinting, and criminal records between the UK and the EU. And for example, the Illegal Migration Act is a risk for the UK's post-Brexit policing pact with the EU because it could undermine the principle of mutual trust on which the pact is based. The principle of mutual trust means that the UK and the EU trust each other to share information in a secure and confidential manner. However, the Illegal Migration Act could make it more difficult for the UK to share information on migrants who have entered the UK illegally. And this could lead the EU to question whether the UK can be trusted to share information on other matters, such as criminal records. Specifically, the Illegal Migration Act includes provisions that could make it more difficult for the UK, as I said, to share information on migrants who have entered the UK illegally. And for example, the Act would allow the Home Secretary to refuse to share information on migrants who have been refused asylum. And this could make it more difficult for the EU to track down migrants who are wanted in other EU countries. And the EU has already expressed concerns about the Illegal Migration Act. In a letter to the UK government, the EU said that the bill could jeopardize the UK's post-Brexit Policing Act. If the EU decides that the UK has violated the principle of mutual trust, it could suspend the pact's data sharing provisions. And this would make it more difficult for the UK to track down criminals and prevent crime. And the UK's Nationality and Borders Bill, which was passed into law in July 22, has also been criticised by the EU as being incompatible with the TCA. The bill includes provisions that could make it more difficult for the UK to share information with the EU also on migrants who have entered the UK illegally. And if the UK sticks to this act, the EU could suspend the TCA's provisions on data sharing. And this would mean that the UK would lose access to important EU databases on criminal records and fingerprints. And this, once again, would make it more difficult for the UK to track down criminals and prevent crime. And the EU is deeply concerned about both new laws, and has warned seriously that the bill could jeopardize the Policing Act. The TCA's provisions on data sharing, as I said, are based on the principle of mutual trust. And if they cannot be trusted anymore, this cannot be upheld. And both new migration laws in the UK, could undermine this trust. Both acts are really making it difficult to share information on migrants if the civil servants do that. And if they don't share, why should the EU share? And if the EU suspends those TCA provisions on data sharing, the EU would lose really important access, because we're talking about 28 others, the 27 members and the EU itself. And this brings really trouble, because the UK would no longer be able to access the Schengen Information System, the so-called SIS2, which is a database of wanted persons and stolen goods. And this would make it definitely more difficult for the UK to identify and arrest criminals who are wanted in other EU countries as well. And the loss of the UK's post-Brexit policing pact with the EU would also have a significant impact on the UK's cooperation with Europol and Eurojust. And these are two EU agencies that work with law enforcement agencies across the EU to combat crime. The UK is a member of both agencies, but the loss of the TCA's data sharing provisions would make it more difficult for the UK to share information with these agencies. And this once again makes it more difficult for the UK to track down criminals who are operating across borders. The potential loss of the UK's post-Brexit policing pact with the EU is a serious matter. It would have a significant impact on the UK's ability to track down criminals and prevent crime, and it would also send a signal to the EU that the UK is not committed to its international obligations, as we've seen in other areas as well. And the UK's Nationality and Borders Bill is a controversial piece of legislation. It has been criticised by human rights groups and refugee advocates. The bill introduced a number of changes to the UK's asylum system. For example, creating a two-tier system for asylum seekers, with those who arrive in the UK irregularly being treated less favourably than those who arrive regularly. And I'm not talking about Rwanda here already. And it's making it more difficult for people to claim asylum in the UK by making it harder to prove that they are refugees. And they introduced a new offshoring policy that would allow the UK to send asylum seekers to other countries to have their claims processed. And the worst part is stripping British citizenship from people who are deemed to have obtained it by deception or fraud. And the bill has been criticized for creating a hostile environment for asylum seekers and for undermining the UK's commitment to international refugee law. And human rights groups have warned that the act will lead to people being denied asylum even if they are genuine refugees. And the Illegal Migration Act I talked in the beginning about is another risk for the UK's post-Brexit policing act with the EU, because it also undermines the principle of mutual trust. And the whole Rwanda thing and not letting them in the country ever again and so on is a different matter, because there we're talking about international law itself. But the Illegal Migration Act could make it more difficult for the UK to share information on migrants as well. And this will make the EU question as well. Can the UK be trusted? I personally have my very personal opinion on that, because for a long time they can't be trusted anymore in certain areas. But the provisions of the Illegal Migration Act will make it more difficult to go through with the policing treaties here from the TCA. And the bill would allow the Home Secretary to refuse to share information on migrants as well. And how can the EU work with something like this? And the EU, of course, has reacted on both laws and both bills that were introduced in Parliament. And they not in diplomacy, it's always said they expressed concerns, but I'm quite sure they're quite furious in normal terms about this. Because if the EU decides that the UK has violated the principle of mutual trust, it could just suspend the data sharing provisions. And then this part of the TCA is just over. The TCA I was talking about stands for Trade and Cooperation Agreement. It is not only but also a free trade agreement between the European Union and the United Kingdom that was signed on December 30th in 2020, and the TCA entered into force on May 1st in 2021. And the TCA covers a wide range of areas, including trade in goods and services, but also investment, fisheries, transport, and law enforcement cooperation. It also includes provisions on the participation of the UK in some EU programs, or the possible participation. The TCA is a complex agreement, and it's still too early to say what will be the full impact, because not everything is implemented yet. But it's clear that the TCA will have a significant impact on the UK's economy and its relationship with the EU. The alternative, the WTO, will be something different. And the free trade part means that goods and services can kinda move freely between the two countries without tariffs or quotas. It doesn't include everything, but still. And the TCA also includes provisions on investment, and this means that businesses from the UK and the EU are still able to invest in each other's markets without restrictions. And there are the fisheries. I will make a video on fisheries again this week, but it means that the UK and the EU will continue to share access to fish stocks in the North Sea and other parts of the Atlantic Ocean. And the TCA also includes provisions on transport, and this means that airlines and other transport companies from the UK and the EU will be able to operate freely between the two countries. And the TCA also includes provisions on law enforcement cooperation, which is the topic of this video. And this means that the UK and the EU wanted to continue to cooperate on issues such as terrorism and organized crime. In general, the TCA is a significant achievement for both the UK and the EU because it provides a framework for the future cooperation, and it will help to ensure that the UK's economy is not hit as hard as with the hardest Brexit, the Brexit that the Brexiteers always wanted, the WTO Brexit, but is still not mitigating all the damages caused by Brexit. But undermining this agreement now with the migration policy is definitely not doing well, because in 2026 the EU and the UK will talk again how this TCA worked. And if you're interested in more topics on Brexit or UK politics, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.